thanks for coming out. I am David Korn, the Washington Bureau Chief from Mother Jones Magazine, and you can check us out at motherjones.com. We are very proud with our new issue, which I'll hold up a cover of here. It just came out called Torture Hits Home, to feature within it a piece by Peter Bergen called The Body Snatchers. It's about an extraordinary rendition, a particular one, of a fellow named Abu Omar, who was snatched off the streets of Milan in Italy in 2003 and brought to Egypt, where he was tortured. It's particularly relevant that the snatching was done by the CIA in our name, in the so-called war against terrorism. And Peter will describe the article and talk about some of the ideas it raises. To me, it still is kind of stunning that, that we have a debate in this country about the appropriateness of such actions, kidnapping, torture, and the like. And it really goes on almost on a daily basis now, and you can include wiretapping in that. And the take-home quote, for me at least, in Peter's piece, is when he quotes the Italian prosecutor who's making a case against the CIA, and he'll tell you the details. He says, "It is possible to combat terrorism without extraordinary means." To me, that seems to be the rub of it, the nut here. Can we go after terrorists who do pose a threat and who have killed our country men and women without resorting to this type of tactics that we've disparaged and have protested in the past, and which, as Peter shows in this case, quite frankly, are illegal? It's an ongoing debate that hasn't stopped, and I'm glad that Mother Jones and Peter are part of that. Let me just give you a little background on Peter and Katherine, and then I'll turn it over to them. They'll talk, and you can ask questions afterwards. Peter had the good fortune as an enterprising journalist to get to know a fellow before a lot of us did by the name of Osama bin Laden, and was one of the first Western journalists to interview him, talk to him, and start raising questions about him that were sadly ignored by too many. Since then, he has written several books, including Holy War, Inc., Inside the Secret World of Osama bin Laden, and I think more recently, Osama bin Laden I Know, The Osama bin Laden I Know, an oral history of Al-Qaeda's leader, which came out 2 years ago. You might recognize him from TV. Anytime terrorism is in the news, CNN calls him, and he obliges. He's made repeated trips to Afghanistan and Pakistan and Egypt and other places around the world to enhance his expertise on the issue. And he is the Schwartz Senior Fellow at the New America Foundation. I'll give you him in one moment. Let me just give Katherine's introduction now, so we can move quickly to her after he's done. She is a Program Associate for the Nuclear Strategy and Non-Proliferation Initiative of the New American Foundation. And with Peter, she has been studying extraordinary renditions, and she'll talk about some of her research after he talks about this. So, Peter, please come up here and explain what an extraordinary rendition is and why it may or may not be a good thing.
All right. Well, thank you very much, David, and thank you for coming to this event. An extraordinary rendition doesn't really have a meaning in legal terms. I mean, but an extraordinary rendition is the following. It's a rendition from country X to country Y where somebody may be tortured. That's the way we defined it. The United States has been rendering people for many, many years. Now, it's important for the beginning to understand the distinction between an extraordinary rendition and an ordinary rendition. An ordinary rendition would be the following, and there's nothing really wrong with it as far as I can tell. The Ramzi Youssef, who bombed the World Trade Center in 1993, He disappeared the day of the bombing, or just before the bombing. He flew to Pakistan, where he had previously, he's of Pakistani descent. He grew up in Kuwait, but he flew back to Pakistan after the Trade Center attack. Now, in 1993, the United States had no extradition treaty with Pakistan. There was little doubt that Ramzi Yousef had masterminded the attack. Many of the people involved in the attack had already been arrested and convicted. He was the subject of a manhunt by somebody I actually quote in the piece, Brad Garrett, FBI, one of the main, an FBI investigator who was involved in arresting Ramzi Yousef, amongst others. And he was taken to the United States, where he then was put on trial, and he was sentenced to 240 years in prison. So we in this discussion and also in this piece, we didn't concern ourselves with ordinary renditions. Ordinary renditions simply being the United States essentially picking somebody up in a country like Pakistan and rendering them, and particularly in the pre-9/11 period, these people faced trials. Ramzi Yousef being one. I'll give you one more example. Miram El-Kansi, for instance, who was executed in Virginia. Again, Brad Garrett, who I quote in the piece, Brad ran the FBI investigation on Miram El-Kansi. Kansi shot 2 CIA employees outside and killed them outside CIA headquarters in '93. Subject of a 4-year manhunt was somebody dropped a dime on him. He was picked up, taken to Virginia, put on trial, and executed. So these are ordinary renditions, and these don't seem to be particularly problematic. Extraordinary renditions, which we define as taking somebody from country X to country Y, using American personnel and transports to a country where they may well be tortured, are obviously more problematic, particularly since the United States is a signatory to the United Nations Convention Against Torture, which suggests that you can't take somebody to another country, if you have substantial reasons to believe that they will be tortured. Now, in the case of Abu Omar, who's the person we profiled, or I profiled in this issue, were there substantial reasons that if you sent somebody to Egypt who was a former member or a present member of the Islamic group, which is an Egyptian terrorist group, were there substantial reasons to believe that he would be tortured? And the answer, of course, is yes. I mean, by the State Department's own reports. You don't have to. It's not sort of a group of bleeding heart liberals who said that Egypt's security services routinely use torture as their sort of main forensic investigative technique. It's the State Department's been saying it for years and years and years. So at the same time that one arm of the U.S. government was arranging this snatch operation for Abu Omar on the grounds that Egypt wasn't a place where he was likely to be tortured, the State Department has repeatedly said that, in fact, somebody like Abu Omar would be a candidate for torture. And, of course, he was. I think there's... I interviewed him in Alexandria. He was released. Let me get into his story a little bit. His story is the following. Armando Spartero, who's the main counterterrorism prosecutor in Milan, who, by the way, is no sort of Euro weenie liberal type. He's put tons of, Brigati Rossi, people behind bars, drug lords, mafia guys. He's not anti-American. He competes in marathons around the country. He's go into his office, it's festooned with decorations from, the DEA and the like. So this is not an anti-American guy, but he had been investigating Abu Omar, who was an Egyptian living in Milan, who was associated with this Islamic cultural institute, which has long been identified as the principal sort of hub of Islamist militancy in Italy. He'd been investigating him for some period of time. And he believed that Abu Omar and his friends were, amongst other things, involved in document fraud and these sorts of issues, but also that they were recruiting people to go to Iraq. And if you think back to when Abu Omar was snatched, it was February of 2003. It was about just as an invasion of Iraq was imminent. Now, Abu Omar, there's no doubt, he denies that he was recruiting anybody to go to Iraq, but he doesn't. He says that yes, that he was sort of agitating about the Iraq War and he was sort of a full-time agitator against it. Despite his denials, he has actually now been charged in 2005 in absentia. He was charged for recruiting people to go to Iraq. So Spartero was doing his own investigation into Abu Omar for these militant activities in Milan. So imagine his surprise when the subject of his investigation just one day disappears. The United States government, United States officials in Milan let it be known around town that Abu Omar had, in fact, gone to the Balkans, where he had his first wife lived in the Balkans. Well, that, of course, was untrue, because what really happened is that a group of largely CIA officials had been surveying Abu Omar for some period of time. They found a street with high walls and very few businesses, and they basically snatched him into a van. They took him from the van to Aviano Air Force Base, and from Aviano Air Force Base to Ramstein Air Force Base, and then from there to Cairo, where he was delivered to the tender mercies of the Egyptian security services, and basically was tortured on and off for 4 years. One of the ironies of all this, there are many ironies in the story, but the Egyptian security services kind of knew that Abu Omar wasn't that big a deal. At one point they said to him, you know, we don't think you're such a big deal, but the Americans have sort of foisted this upon you. And he said, well, if you don't think I'm a big deal, why do you keep torturing me? And they said, well, that's our family tradition. And in fact, that is, in fact, a pretty accurate statement about I don't think Egypt has, I think interrogation is their only, I'm not an expert on the Egyptian sort of judicial system, but it seems to me that interrogation is basically, they put all their eggs in that basket. They don't really do investigations of crimes. They just beat people up and interrogate them, and that's the way that they do an investigation in any crime. And the reason I say that, if you go to YouTube, there have been a number of things that have been posted on YouTube, which may or may not be there now, but they are, in one case, a recent incident where somebody was arrested in a traffic accident and was sort of tortured by the Egyptian police. In another case, a boy was beaten to death, 13-year-old boy, and some of that was captured on videotape. And so this kind of approach this is just a standard Egyptian approach to torture people. And Abu Omar says that he was crucified and raped and many other things. And clearly, you know, a lot of bad things happened to him, and he's basically a broken man. But he was released in February of 2007, and he's, of course, monitored by the security services. Anyway, much of this would not have come to light were it not for the fact that the CIA officials involved in Abu Omar's kidnapping made a number of pretty basic mistakes. First of all, they conducted the whole operation using credit cards. They conducted the whole operation using unencrypted cell phones. And when Armando Spatero and his investigators realized that Abu Omar had disappeared, very quickly they found a witness to the abduction. The next thing they did, which I thought was kind of a cool thing, was they basically said, okay, in this window of 3 hours in a particular geographic location where Abu Omar has disappeared, we're going to look at every cell phone call that's been made in that window. And obviously, you know, Milan is a big city, so it turned out there was something like 10,000 cell phones in use in a sort of several block radius in a 3-hour window at the time of the snatch operation. They put it through Analyst Notebook, which is a commercial data crunching program that a lot of counterterrorism people use, because basically it's a link analysis program. And they found that 17 of the 10,000 phone calls were in constant communication with each other. They then determined that of those 17 phones, one of these phones was making hundreds of phone calls from the residence and country house of the then station chief in Milan, Bob Lady, whose name is public, the CIA station chief in Milan. They also found that these suspicious phone calls, these 17 suspicious phones, several of them had traveled to Aviano Air Force Base. The reason you can tell that is, of course, every time it goes past a phone relay tower, if it makes a call, it gets picked up, you can chart its location. And they also found that some of these suspicious cell phone users were staying at particular hotels in Milan. And in fact, they've treated themselves in pretty nice hotels, these American officials. They stayed at the Principe de Savoia, which is arguably one of the best hotels in the world. It's so fancy that it has its own, it has a room service menu for dogs, which I've never previously encountered. But and they treated themselves as side trips to Venice and the like, and they spent a fair amount of American taxpayers' money. But so basically, by tracing where the cell phones went, they retraced the fact that these people went to Aviano Air Force Base. This tracked fairly well with what Abu Omar, who suddenly was released from prison 14 months after he was taken. He was told not to make any calls to his former friends or wife or whatever. In Italy, of course, the first thing he did was call his wife, say, "Look, sorry, I've been missing for 14 months," and she said, what happened. He kind of began to explain what happened. Now, the Italian investigators, which had been tapping Abu Omar's phone before, continue to tap it. Now they've suddenly got this guy showing up, and what he told his wife and his friends closely match with some of the things they'd already determined based on the cell phone the movement of the cell phones. And then the next thing they did is they looked at every single flight that had taken off from Aviano Air Force Base using records from NATO and from Italian Italian flight control and also from flight control in Brussels, and they found that a particular 10-seater jet had gone from Aviano Air Force Base to Ramstein right around the time Abu Omar likely had disappeared. And then the Chicago Tribune reported that a guy called Philip Morse, who's a part owner of the Boston Red Sox, that a particular plane of his had traveled from Ramstein Air Force Base to Cairo in the same time frame. And so putting all these pieces together, it became clear that, and this plane, by the way, that was owned by Philip Morse, the part owner of the Boston Red Sox, had been used in other CIA abductions and features heavily in Stephen Gray's very good book, Ghost Planes. So that's sort of the story. The trial, by the way, is starting March 12th. So the trial is starting pretty soon. Of course, it's extremely unlikely, in fact, it's almost impossible, I think, that any of the Americans accused will show up. That 26 American officials have been accused. Many of them are believed to be CIA officials. They face some pretty serious time, up to 15 years, kidnapping being a somewhat serious crime in Italy. So if they showed up, in the unlikely event they showed up, they would be facing some fairly serious prison time. CIA, of course, has not commented on this. It doesn't comment on anything to do with the extraordinary rendition program. Bob Lady, the former CIA station chief who sort of orchestrated this, emerges out of the tale as a somewhat tragic figure because he spoke fluent Italian. He understood that there was an Italian investigation into Abu Omar, that it was completely unnecessary to do their own separate kidnapping operation, take him off the streets. And he actually spoke against it, but under pressure from his superiors at Langley and perhaps from the White House, or if you think back to the early 2003 time period, of course, there was a lot of pressure to get results in the war on terrorism. The war in Iraq was starting to happen. This guy, Abu Omar, seemed to be recruiting foreign fighters to go to Iraq. And so Bob Lady, who was forced to actually, even though he was opposed to the idea, he was forced to go ahead and orchestrate this kidnapping. The reason the trial is complicated, I didn't get into this in the piece, but it's sort of, for what it's worth, that Spataro is also indicted some of the leading intelligence figures in Italian spy operation because they also were involved in this. One of the reasons the Americans were so cavalier about their security arrangements, the American officials who snatched Abu Omar, is that they had clued in their counterparts at the highest levels of SISMI, which is Italy's military intelligence operation. And so they probably felt like, there's no reason to take any extra measures, any extraordinary measures. And so Spataro, the Milanese prosecutor, has also indicted top-level officials in the Spanish, in the Italian intelligence agencies. Now, the Constitutional Court in Italy has said, well, wait a minute, this may not be, as it were, kosher, and some of the ways that you gather the evidence in this case, we're concerned about, they may be trespassing on state secrets. Be that as it may, the Constitutional Court will rule on that. But the main point is that the trial against the 26 American officials will go ahead anyway, because all the information that was gathered in that case doesn't involve secret evidence. And also in Italy, you can have trials of people in absentia, unlike in other countries. Before I hand it over to Katherine, let me just two or three quick points about some of the people who are quoted in the piece. The person who implemented the program, Mike Scheuer, who was the head of the Bin Laden unit, the program started in '95, and one thing that was kind of perhaps surprising is that extraordinary renditions were a Clinton administration innovation. They weren't a Bush administration innovation. Certainly, Katherine and I have found that before 9/11 there were only 14 that we could find documented extraordinary renditions. Almost all of them went to Egypt. In the period after 9/11, we found 53 documented extraordinary renditions. And instead of just going to Egypt, they went all over the Middle East, places like Syria, Sudan, etc. But the point is that the program happened under the Clintons, under Clinton. Why was the program implemented in the first place? Mike Scheuer says, look, NSC came to us, Dick Clark, Sandy Berger, and they said, we know these. This was after the U.S. It's in the period after the first Trade Center attack. We know that there are these people out there. We don't necessarily have cases against them, but we'd like to get them off the street. So, according to Mike Scheuer, the initial intent of the Extraordinary Rendition Program was not to get information out of people as it seems to have been later in the game. Essentially, it was to get people off the street, get people picked up, find out what was in their pocket litter, i.e. what they're carrying with them. Is there any information that we can just snatch when we snatch them? Is there any information that they can give up immediately? by just simply what they're carrying, computers and the like. And so the initial intent was that. Scheuer says that the program was quote unquote loyal to death, which I'm sure is true. He also said that it was heavily overseen by the intelligence committees in Congress, and I'm sure that's also true, although I'm sure the number of people who are sort of clued in about it was relatively small. So it began under the Clinton administration. It was expanded under the Bush administration. Is it really necessary is it really necessary at all to have done it? I mean, leaving aside the question of its legality, it seems pretty obvious that the extraordinary rendition program is not legal. I'm not a lawyer, but if you read the UN Conventions Against Torture, it says, is there a basically substantial reason to believe that transferring somebody from country A to country B where they might be tortured, that is essentially illegal, and that's what it says. And there's somebody called Michael Garcia, who was, I believe, now he's a Bush administration appointee in the Southern District of New York. He wrote kind of a sort of legal brief, sort of saying, but it seemed to me. Saying that extraordinary renditions were somehow, that there was a legal case for them. It seems to me that on the face of it, they're not. Are they effective? Well, yeah, they do take people off the street. Are they really necessary is another whole, Abu Omar certainly, I'm not sure what it gained us other than a great deal of opprobrium at the Abu Omar case. But let's say Abu Omar was a big-time terrorist. Would it have been more effective to have had somebody interrogate him without torturing him? Let me answer that by saying that if you talk to people in the FBI, of course, there's a big difference between how people in the FBI see this and people in the CIA. People in the FBI, their view is the best interrogation technique is a Diet Coke. That's their view. People in the CIA obviously felt that that wasn't the case. It seems to me that now the FBI view is winning. I thought it was very interesting, for instance, the Washington Post piece. We're going to put Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the operational commander of 9/11, on trial, and also Ramzi bin al-Shibh and others in a military tribunal in Guantanamo. What's interesting is that the FBI and military interrogators have gone into Guantanamo, and that's the so-called clean team, and they're getting information from Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and Ramzi bin al-Shibh and others that's completely independent of anything that they might have said to the CIA. So that even though there's still a problem with that because of the fruit of the poison tree kind of argument, but still the CIA seems to have lost this argument. Tom Malinowski, who works in this building, I asked him for Human Rights Watch, are these extraordinary renditions still going on? And he said, well, probably not from rule of law countries, meaning that it's unlikely that we'll see, an extraordinary rendition from somewhere like Italy in the future. It's very hard to answer negatives. Much of the program is secret. Katherine, who's going to speak to you next, will get into more detail about what we could find out, what's available on the public record. Are these programs still going on? I think it's just impossible to answer.
Thank you, Peter.
Hi, I'm Katherine Tiedemann. Thank you all for coming out today, and thanks to Peter and Mother Jones for orchestrating today's event. I'll just speak for a few minutes about the details of the renditions program. So, as Peter mentioned, the scope and reach of the CIA's extraordinary renditions program have always, by the very nature of it, been difficult to determine because the details are kept so highly classified by the CIA, which administers it. So, in order to study the subject and provide a more data-based analysis of the program, we had to rely on information that was readily available to the public. Our research is culled from reports from human rights organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, NYU Law, the ACLU. Books on the topic, Peter mentioned Stephen Gray's Ghost Plane and Andy Worthington's book, and accounts from the media. So while we certainly don't have a full set of data for each case of extraordinary rendition, and it is fair to say that our knowledge is hampered for a number of reasons, our research helps paint a more complete picture of the very secretive and controversial program. So it's worth pointing out that the facts in the public domain are comprehensive, but it's not as if we're ignoring information that the government releases. The CIA doesn't comment on this story, and it doesn't release facts and figures about individuals who have been rendered, so we have no other means of evaluating the details of this very controversial program than the open sources that I previously mentioned. This puts the onus now on the government to release these facts and figures about these individuals who have been rendered, and to assure the public that, unlike in the case of Abu Omar that Peter talked about, we will no longer circumvent the international legal system and turn over suspects to countries whose interrogation techniques are well known to use torture. The CIA should focus less on covering up the program of extraordinary rendition and more on devising ways to get the information they need from terrorist suspects in more ethical, humane ways. And we're continually reminded that this topic is still very relevant. With the recent disclosure by British Foreign Secretary David Miliband that 2 rendition flights refueled on UK territory in 2002, and the possibility that some detainees have been held on Diego Garcia, it is more important than ever to keep this business in the public eye and to adopt an analytical, not polemical approach. Thus, we found it very important to be methodologically sound in studying the subject. As Peter mentioned, all in all, we found information on 67 total cases of extraordinary rendition before and after 9/11. Because of the covert nature of the program, little is known about cases before September 11th. What we do know is that former CIA Director George Tenet testified before the 9/11 Commission in 2004 that over 80 renditions occurred before September 11th, and we think the program began in 1995, as Peter said. Within the public domain, we found information on 29 total cases of rendition, 14 of which qualify as extraordinary by our definition. So of the 14, an overwhelming majority, 12 of them, were sent to Egypt. At least 3 of those individuals were executed. At least 4 are still currently in prison. The other 2 went to Saudi Arabia and Jordanian prisons. Only 1 that we know of has been released. So after September 11th, both the pace and the number of destinations for extraordinary renditions increased. Former government officials have anonymously estimated that between 100 and 150 terrorists have been flown from one country to another since September 11th, courtesy of the CIA. From the information that's publicly available, again, we found that the number of extraordinary renditions more than tripled after September 11th. Although we found information on 117 total renditions, once we excluded the destinations of American custody, Afghanistan, Guantanamo Bay Prison, and the CIA secret prison network that's come under so much fire recently, 53 of those qualified as extraordinary rendition. So the sheer number of suspects rendered is not the only notable finding of our study. Rather than just sending individuals to Egypt after September 11th, the CIA diversified rendition destinations, shipping people to places like Jordan and Syria. 18 individuals were sent to Jordanian and Syrian prisons. 6 were sent to Libya, 4 to Morocco, 7 still to Egypt, and a handful each sent to places like Yemen, Pakistan, Ethiopia, Algeria, Zimbabwe, and Sudan. Not exactly country club destinations. As Peter mentioned, these countries have been repeatedly criticized by the State Department and by a plethora of human rights groups and advocacy organizations for documented torture or other cruel, degrading treatment in prisons. So what do we know about these 53 individuals who've been rendered since 9/11? More than a quarter have come out and said they were tortured while in foreign custody. Several more imply such treatment through either vague or secondhand descriptions. 4 say they were tortured by the CIA at some point in their journeys. In total, at least a third of the cases we looked at show some evidence of torture while in foreign custody. This doesn't mean, of course, that more were not tortured. The current conditions and whereabouts of 19 of the individuals since their renditions are unknown. We simply don't know what's happened to these people, so it should be the responsibility of the U.S. government to increase the transparency of this program. In terms of where the CIA picked up all these suspected terrorists, more than half of the 53 renditions came from Pakistan. Almost a third came from African countries like Sudan and Somalia. 7 of the renditions we looked at eventually found their way to Guantanamo Bay. Remarkably, but unsurprisingly, only one of the 53 has explicitly come out and said he was not tortured while in foreign custody. So it's important to remember that these statistics represent people like Abu Omar, who Peter discussed, who have been arrested, mistreated, abused, released, rearrested, detained, kept in limbo outside the international legal system, and tortured. Unfortunately, Abu Omar's case was not an anomaly, but just one case in a larger pattern. Since September 11th, the Extraordinary Renditions Program has more than tripled in size. It's the 3-way intersection of human rights, counterterrorism efforts, and intelligence gathering. Unfortunately, under this program, all 3 of these arenas have suffered significant and long-term setbacks. Thank you.
Okay, now we'll turn to some questions and answers, hopefully some answers. I know we'll have questions. And let me start with this, Peter. Before I do that, I should just do a plug and say, if you haven't gotten a copy of Mother Jones magazine, there's some outside for you here, you can read Peter's story online at motherjones.com. Peter, the argument is that extraordinary times, demand extraordinary measures. And I continue to be fascinated by the debate that you alluded to between those who believe torture produces valuable information and those who don't. I'm not talking about Egyptian police officers, but I mean people within the U.S. government. In the book that I wrote with Michael Isikoff Hubris, we told the case about al-Libi, who was rendered extraordinarily out of FBI custody in Afghanistan. The FBI had him, and they were giving him the Diet Cokes and actually getting intelligence out of him that they thought was very, very solid and sufficient. But the CIA believed it wasn't. He wasn't telling all. He was sent to Egypt, where he was, put in boxes the size of this table and beaten up a bit. And he ended up telling them that Iraq had given training in chemical and biological weaponry to Al-Qaeda, which was intelligence that President Bush cited October 8th, 2002, while he was trying to get Congress to pass the Iraq War resolution. And it was also intelligence that Colin Powell cited at his very famous UN speech. Intelligence that we now know to be without any basis in fact. But despite episodes like that, and even within the CIA, Milton Bearden, who was a CIA officer who worked with the Mujahideen, wrote a very good piece in the New York Times, 2-3 years ago at least, in which he said torture doesn't produce good intelligence. So you have the FBI guys who handled al-Libi and other FBI guys in general. You have even people like Milton Bearden saying that we don't believe torture produces good information. But yet there are others who seem to believe exactly the opposite. And then in cases like with Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and others, waterboarding and other forms of torture, were productive. How are we who live outside the dark world to assess these competing claims?
Well, the al-Libi case is particularly, particularly appropriate. And I was at one point in a longer draft thought about, exploring it, and of course you explored it in your book, David. And if there was, a single argument against the use of torture producing sort of false information, it would be that, because, without al-Libi, that was I think the only real link that was made between Al-Qaeda and WMD and Iraq. Without al-Libi, almost everything that Colin Powell said in his presentation turns out to be wrong. But there were two dimensions to its wrongness. There was the curveball dimension about the mobile bio weapons trailers, which of course was wrong. And then there was this link to Al-Qaeda, which was pretty striking, if indeed.
Powell called it the sinister nexus.
Yes. And anyway, so al-Libi, the al-Libi case sort of speaks for itself. The short answer is we don't know what works. There is no science there's been no scientific study to say, does torture work better than just regular interrogation? Of course, there would be some sort of significant ethical concerns about doing a kind of doing an experiment along these lines. But I think that we know, there's the question of what is more useful, and all we have is anecdote to answer that question. On one side we have, people I respect greatly, one or two I quoted in the piece, but Brad Garrett, the FBI investigator who basically got an uncoerced, fulsome confession from Ramzi Youssef, the bomber of the first Trade Center bombing. He got an uncoerced, fulsome confession from Miram Il-Kansi. Similarly, Dan Coleman, who was the leading FBI investigator on Al-Qaeda, he's I don't know if you read Jane Mayer's piece in The New Yorker, which is really a debate between Coleman on one side and Mike Scheuer from the CIA on the other, in a sense, about this question. Coleman comes very heavily against the use of any kind of interrogation technique other than the usual ones. And look at George Piro's interrogation of Saddam Hussein, which yielded all sorts of George Piro, the Arabic-speaking Lebanese-American interrogator of Saddam Hussein, who spent 7 months with him, and got an amazing amount of stuff out of Saddam. So there's the FBI side of this, and then there's the agency side, who obviously felt that this was the right way to go. But of course, no one in the CIA had really done interrogations. They the people, I think this is, of course, has changed, but particularly initially, there was this sort of cartoon-like idea that if you rough somebody up, that they'll finally tell you what you really need to know. And in fact, speaking of which, Paul Wolfowitz, I think you reported in your book, David, Paul Wolfowitz wanted to turn Ramzi Youssef, the bomber of the First Trade Center, the mastermind of the First Trade Center attack, into an enemy combatant, so he would be taken and roughed up, and would finally admit what Wolfowitz believed he was, which was that he was an Iraqi spy. Well, luckily DOJ said no, and in fact Ramzi Youssef wasn't an Iraqi spy, he's a Pakistani who got nothing to do with the Iraqis. But I think that there was, coming out of the 9/11, I think part of this is explicable also. If you're evacuating your office on September 11th and you've never heard of Al-Qaeda, bin Laden, you've never thought that non-state actors are a threat, you're so surprised that you're going to make some extraordinary decisions. And so I think part of these decisions were based on really, in some senses, understandable feeling that 9/11 was a sort of watershed event. But it would have been much less of a watershed event if the people who'd been making these decisions had actually thought that Al-Qaeda or bin Laden were a threat anyway. If you do a database search on the words Al-Qaeda or bin Laden for Condoleezza Rice, George W. Bush, Vice President Cheney, Paul Wolfowitz, you will find that they said nothing about this threat before 9/11. Except with one exception. Paul Wolfowitz had mentioned Al-Qaeda as a worry in the context of its supposed connections to Saddam Hussein. So I think part of these decisions were conducted in an environment where there was a great deal of surprise, and therefore a feeling that extraordinary measures needed to be taken. But if they'd adopted the FBI approach in the first place, which is now, I think there is a Congress that's already passed a law now saying the CIA has to adhere to the Army Field Manual standards. So, I mean, the environment has changed, and what we're talking about may all be historical at this point.
And of course, that law doesn't affect, I think, extraordinary renditions where we don't technically do the torture ourselves.
Right. Actually, one important thing about an extraordinary rendition is that there's a rather Jesuitical approach that we take to make sure that it's legal, which is when Abu Omar was arrested, he was arrested by a real Italian police officer who was sort of conned into this. I won't bore you with the details right now. So it's not a kidnapping; it's a legal arrest in Italy, and there's some sort of subterfuge to kind of give it some kind of appearance of legality. In this case, using an Italian police officer.
Okay, let's have some questions from the audience. I'm going to ask you to stand, speak loudly, so maybe our mics will even catch your question. And also, if you have an institutional affiliation, tell us what it is. Okay? You, sir.
Matt Bajanski, Partnership for Secure America. First, in response to the last point about Congress having passed the law applying the Army Field Manual, all expectations are that the administration is going to be vetoing that. So
right.
I don't know how much it changed the environment. I think that the rhetoric has changed. I guess I want to come back to your definition, Peter, of the rendition process, and this is not a lawyer's question, although, disclosure, I am one, former military lawyer as well. And that is that there are two pieces to it, and piece one is the kidnapping part. It's the extrajudicial part, the part that, as much as you may be using a police officer to say polizia and make the arrest, it's still extrajudicial, and then you're moving someone without an actual extradition treaty. And the second part is the torture part. And I feel like the torture part, you're right, the environment has changed. It's easier to make the argument that this is justified, that it doesn't work. And so in some degree, 90% of what we're saying, doesn't need to be said as much today as it maybe needed to be said 4 years ago. But I feel like we're not really framing the argument against the first part still, because the argument in favor of the extrajudicial component is an urgency argument, is an argument that legal processes are not sufficient, particularly foreign governments in Western Europe that don't care as much as we do about this problem. They're not acting fast enough. So even if we promise not to torture someone or take countries like Egypt and Syria off the list of destinations for these folks, the notion that we might need to act without due legal process and the slowdown that might involve seems like it would still have some currency in the debate. And I wonder how you all would frame the argument against that part of the question, without so much reference to torture.
Let me just repeat it for a second. So the question essentially is that when it comes to extraordinary renditions, there are two components that are troublesome. One is the torture at the at the destination site, but the other is the initial pickup, and whether that's extrajudicial and is not really being overseen by judges, courts, without warrants, even if they manage to get a police officer, involved in the initial snatch. And while the torture aspect of this has gotten a lot of attention, and maybe public opinion, certainly in Europe, maybe even so in the United States, has become now an issue that a lot of people oppose, if not a majority, the whole notion of just acting in this extrajudicial fashion because we can hasn't raised the same level of opposition.
I mean, I think there's a good reason for that, because I think it's a lot more defensible. I mean, going back, I'm sure there are arguments against it, but from my own personal perspective, rendering Ramzi Youssef to face trial in the United States, which was an extrajudicial procedure, there is no extradition treaty with Pakistan at the time, there may be one now, that seems pretty defensible. So part of the thing is, Katherine and I, we wanted to really focus in on the more extreme questions, which are, rendering people to countries that aren't the United States. So that's why we excluded, if we're rendering, we kind of know we have a pretty good sense of what's going on in Guantanamo, relatively speaking. We have a much more imperfect sense of what's going on in Bagram Air Force Base, which is a hugely undercovered story, but it's sort of essentially a Guantanamo in Afghanistan. But we decided to exclude those because there's a lot of talk about torture and what constitutes torture or not, but clearly, waterboarding may or may not be torture. We can debate that. There's no debating about what happened to Abu Omar in an Egyptian prison. This is, he was delivered to a group of people who tortured him for 4 years. And so maybe this is simply journalistic thinking, but we wanted to kind of make the story more manageable and not sort of deal with everything. And I think on your point, I understand the distinction, but you can make an argument that, the extrajudicial snatch of somebody who's actually going to face a real trial in the United States, that's pretty defensible. I think that is defensible. They're not tortured. Their rights, they have rights. They have lawyers. They have an open trial. If they're guilty, they go to prison. If they're innocent, they don't. That's a very different matter than the Abu Omar case. Go ahead.
I just refine that for a second by suggesting that under the current legal framework, as long as those folks are treated as illegal combatants under the current law, they can actually be held pretty much indefinitely, even assuming that they're not going to be tortured. So they don't have the rights that you're saying they would have, which would sort of make it okay with all of us, that they get kidnapped, and yet they're being kidnapped without the prospect of torture because they're not being brought to Egypt or something. That's the argument I'm concerned about anticipating when the torture part of this debate drops out, as I think we all hope it will in the next year.
Well, I suppose you can have a rendition in which someone ends up being in trial, and then a rendition where someone ends up in Guantanamo or some other facility forever without being charged under the current administration's interpretation.
And clearly, instead of 53 examples of that, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, and but for the purposes of this study and this story, we were focusing on the extraordinary rendition, which, as I said, is not a legal term; it's more of a journalistic term.
You right over there.
Yes, Mike Hager, Education for Employment Foundation. The discussion of whether torture works or whether this process makes sense in the environment of a war on terror is a bit disturbing for me. I think it's in the nature of whether the ends justify the means. I don't think that's the issue. I think the rock bottom issue for this country is whether this country will adhere to the rule of law. Because what I see is across the board, whether you look at stage 1 kidnapping or stage 2 torture, we're talking about an abandonment of the rule of law in this country. And as a lawyer, that's been most disturbing to me.
I didn't hear a question, but the question would be, is adherence to the rule of law the overarching issue here? And in the work that you've done on this, both of you, I'll put this to you too, Katherine, do you see anywhere in the government where that issue is being addressed, even if the answer is not the answer that our questioner would want to see?
Well, I think this. I think the fact that the so-called clean team went into Guantanamo speaks for itself, because I mean, clearly the people really, the Khalid Sheikh Mohammed trial, I mean, to have that blow apart on the basis of the fact that he's been waterboarded, obviously it would be a disaster. So I think, people are trying to walk back the cat. The question is, can you walk back a cat that's already been waterboarded? And that may be difficult. In answer to your sort of what was implicit in your comments, sir, I think it's useful to look at the U.S. Embassy trials, the trial of the people involved in the U.S. Embassy attacks in 1998, because that provides a pretty good model of maybe what we should have done in the first place. Now, 4 people were convicted in those trials. There were a number of public goods that were served. One, the families of the victims attended much of the trial and saw these guys in the dock. Some of them even testified about the effect of the bombings on their loved ones and their lives. There was a public good also because for the first time Al-Qaeda's interest in weapons of mass destruction and buying these materials became public. No classified information that was used in the trial leaked out. Everybody involved, the 4 people who were convicted, are serving life without parole in prison. So they're basically living a sort of life entombed in places like Florence, Colorado. Which raises the question, maybe we have a model for this already. It's worked very well with all sorts of terrorist trials that we've done. And the question is, how do you get back to that model, given the fact that all the things have happened, and we can decry the things that have happened, but how do you now change what is happening? And it's everybody says, let's close Guantanamo. Well, closing Guantanamo is both easy and hard. It's easy to say, and it's maybe hard to do because, of course, some of the people aren't, their home countries don't want them or incapable of incarcerating them and the like. But the question, I think, going forward is, okay, so given that all the criticisms that exist, the valid criticisms, what do we do next? Do we set up, for instance, national security courts that would be basically like the FISA court, except that they would be actually involved in trying some of the people in Guantanamo outside the military tribunal system? I don't know. I'm not a lawyer, but I'm just saying we need to be thinking about what's the next. I mean, as you were sort of saying, this story is going to continue. It's like what are the policy options that exist in the future to deal with this? And also there will be people. The president in 2009 will be faced with. This may be not. Maybe people will disagree with this, but when the White House lawyer said the Guantanamo Conventions were quaint when it came to Al-Qaeda, that wasn't such an extraordinary idea. A group of non-state actors conducting terrorist activity, that's not something that the Geneva Conventions really kind of conceived of. And so the idea perhaps that we could have perhaps a new president come in and say, well, maybe these Geneva Conventions need to be updated because there would be other countries around the world who would have a similar interest in this. Okay.
Well, okay, I just wonder, on the extrajudicial nature of these extraordinary renditions and such. Even in the open literature, do you see much in the way of people looking at that question, either in our governments overseas? There's been some, there was a hullabaloo over the flights at some point, and that seems to have died down, hasn't it?
Well, I think there have been several good investigations of the extra legal nature of the program. I think the Council on Europe released a report, and there have been, countless reports by both individuals and by these human rights groups. Human Rights Watch put out one. Amnesty has a great investigation into this. So people are looking at the question, as Peter said. The question now is, where do we go from here? So.
Jim Pickner, George Mason University. Just a couple of points on Al Libby. The Defense Intelligence Agency did burn him in February 2002, and so DIA had that information when Bush then later gave the speech, and memos are on R11's website. On the scientific study, within the last year, a bunch of high-level people did that and looked at all of the literature out there, and I can't remember the title or the people, but I've got it on my website there on my own CD, and it's on the website. On the rule of law.
Well, what do the studies say?
Yes.
Oh, it said that
this was a study on the effectiveness of torture and interrogations.
Yeah,
Okay.
and it said exactly what you were saying. But the FBI say this does not work very well. And once in a while it might, but all the professionals say that this is not the best way to do it, and the FBI are right on that. And so are the military people from World War II, Korea, and so forth. They all say that.
And of course, the counter-argument is the ticking time bomb argument. But Clive Stafford Smith, who has written a very good book about Guantanamo, he did a documentary, which I haven't seen, but he recounts in the book, where he interviews a number of people who are supporting the ticking time bomb idea. And he says, give me an example in the last 100 years where there's been a ticking time bomb and torture has worked. And of course, they don't have an answer. He says, okay, well, give me an example in the last 500 years where, an historical example. And of course, the ticking time bomb, it's a fiction. It doesn't exist. There is no example that can be
You
come
obviously
to.
don't watch 24.
Indeed.
And
But
I think the title of that was Educing Information. So
Educing information, that's exactly what it is. That's it. I think it's the National Science Foundation. I mean, so people are trying to look at this in a scientific way now.
And the rule of law, I think, is just crucial on this. And the irony is that David Addington and John Yoo and those people went through tremendous efforts to try to legalize all this stuff, and it is wrong, but they really tried, ironically. And on Geneva, Colin Powell wrote back to Gonzalez and said Geneva did anticipate it could cover all of these things, and they were a very compelling argument to Gonzalez, who, of course, ignored.
Any comments on that?
Yeah, no.
Okay, thank you. You've been patient?
I'm Ed Spanis from Executive Intelligence Review. I mean, first, I've never understood this notion that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed had to be waterboarded to get him to talk, because he admitted or confessed to Yosri Fuda on Al Jazeera prior to his capture, taking full responsibility for 9/11. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth explaining a little bit more about that. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the operational commander of 9/11, sat down with Yossi Fuda of Al Jazeera, and he gave him like 2 days of interview, along with Ramzi bin al-Shib. In which
This was when?
This was the interview was conducted April 2002. It aired the first anniversary of 9/11, and it laid out in great detail everything you needed to know about 9/11. It answered some questions that we wanted. It answered the question, where was United Flight 93 going to, the one that crashed in the Pennsylvania field? Well, it wasn't. They said it was targeting the Capitol, not the White House, and that makes sense. The White House is a tiny little building from the air, surrounded by trees. It's very hard to hit, as opposed to the Capitol. It also answered the question, how was Bin Laden apprised of events? And they explained that Ramzi bin al-Shib traveled to Afghanistan shortly before the attack to tell Bin Laden it's going to happen on this day. It also explained the way they communicated with Mohammed Atta, the lead hijacker. And if you read the 9/11 Commission report, there's almost no distance between what the 9/11 Commission report said about it received summaries of the interrogations of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and Ramzi bin al-Shib. And it's the same thing that they told Yosri Fuda. All you needed to do was do a Google search when Khalid Sheikh Mohammed came in to basically get what you needed. Not only was it on Al Jazeera, it was a massive piece in the London Sunday Times. Fuda then wrote a book about it. There was nothing, but and then in the government's defense, you can say, well, okay, but there were things that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed gave up that, we take it for granted. We take it, yes, that this 9/11 stuff was out there, but what about all those great plots he gave up? Well, it turns out that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed gave up a number of plots, almost all of which were basically talk. For instance, the plan to attack buildings on the West Coast and these sorts of things with planes. The only thing he gave up that I can determine of any real substance was Faris, Faris was the Ohio truck driver, no doubt a member of Al Qaeda, friend of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's, but also somebody who was planning to bring down the Brooklyn Bridge with a pair of gas cutters, which is akin to trying to bring down the Empire State Building with a firecracker. I mean, it's just not going to happen. So even the point is that KSM, his 9/11 material was out there publicly. It was unnecessary to waterboard him, and the plots he gave up were not that significant.
Anyway, that wasn't my question.
Yeah.
Okay, let's have a quick question.
Yeah, two things I wanted to take a mild issue with, Peter. One, you're giving Michael Scheuer a lot of credibility. A few months ago, I was at a conference in which he spoke on a panel, and I asked a question in front of a large audience of lawyers about torture and rendition. And as soon as I mentioned Abu Omar, he said, "Oh, that was an Italian operation. That wasn't our operation."
Well, he was out of the government when it happened, or he was working in the CIA library. He wouldn't have known anything about it.
And then the other thing is you talked about sort of counterposing the FBI and the CIA, but my understanding from people I've spoken to is that there was a lot of opposition in the CIA to this kind of thing. There was no uniform CIA position, and as you referenced, there was even dispute within Italy between the Rome station chief and the Milan station chief over
Yeah.
this.
No, I think you're right. I mean, clearly, and there's a story, I believe, in the Post today where certain CIA high-ranking officials would just not go to meetings where they thought these things would be talked about, either because they were concerned about legal repercussions or they were personally opposed to it. So, yeah, there was obviously disagreement within the agency itself about this.
Peter, you said there are 26 people indicted in the Italian
Yeah.
case. Are they indicted by their names?
Yeah, well, this is a very interesting question. It's
The Americans.
I mean, and by the way, if you Google, a lot of the documents have been translated into English, and they're Googleable. And Spatero did a first-class investigation, and one of the mistakes of one of the people involved in the snatch operation, she registered under her real name. Her name's Monica Adler. Again, it's public knowledge. And there are a number of officials they're not CIA officials, or they're sufficiently high up the food chain so that their real names are known. Bob Lady being the Milan station chief, Jeff Castelli, who was the Rome station chief, who's still at the agency. Again, his name has been publicly revealed already. But to get to David's question, how many are in their real names? It's Spatero's view that a number of them may be real names, and some of the people who aren't actually working for the agency or are working in support positions within the American consulate or embassy in Italy, their real names show up.
Hi, I'm Wendy Patton from the Open Society Institute, and my question is about the upcoming trial in the Abu Omar case.
Yeah.
What do you expect to emerge from that trial in terms of new facts or information about how this particular rendition took place? Will the trial shed new light on the way this program works? Will we get an opportunity to learn more about what's happening? What do you expect?
So the question is, will the trial, it's starting when? You said
March 12th.
shed any new light, or has your piece of Mother Jones already told us all we're going to know?
Well, I mean, I think it's pretty hard to beat. I mean, I'm sort of in awe of the case that they produced. It's a very different judicial system than an American judicial system, and it's like the Spanish system. I mean, there's the magistrates lay out a massively detailed case, and in this case, it runs to thousands of pages in Italian and several hundred pages in English. The trial is supposed to. Spatero thinks the trial will go on for about a year when it happens. Presumably, there will be tidbits that come out, but it's hard for me to conceive of what new, really, major substantive piece of information would come out, because it's already been very well investigated by the Italian investigators.
My name is Phil Jones, and I'm international consultant with Kimmett Center Coast in Frankfurt. My question is just on the torture part of itself, and it's a little bit not on your subject, but maybe from your expertise or your research, you can answer. As far as the military goes, on the Abu Ghraib, it was well documented that there was torture going on, or what considered torture. Now, when if we capture someone that is a terrorist in Afghanistan or Iraq, has our military now policing its own self to where this type of thing is not going on?
Yeah, well, the question is, when it comes to capturing terrorists in Iraq or Afghanistan or suspected terrorists, is the military handling them different than they did under Abu Ghraib and policing its own interrogation and detention methods?
Yes, I mean, it's certainly, well, in Iraq, for instance, a very effective two-star general has been appointed by Petraeus to run the prison system, and it's run in a way that, I mean, they're keenly aware there can't be another Abu Ghraib. And of course, the Army Field Manual it prohibits the use of coercion, abuse, torture. In Afghanistan, I think an area that is really underexplored is what's happening at Bagram Air Force Base, because Guantanamo is actually, in some levels, a quite transparent place in the sense that journalists do go there, and there have been, many journalists have visited. They may not be shown everything that's going on. But Bagram Air Force Base is sort of a black hole, and Bagram Air Force Base has a lot more people than Guantanamo now. And so if there's an area that needs to be sort of a new area to be explored, is what's happening at Bagram. What's going on in Iraq, I think, it seems that they've got their house in order.
until the next round of photos come out.
I don't think you take cell phones into any of these places now for obvious reasons.
All the way in the back.
I'm Bob Weinberg. I'm an adjunct professor of criminal procedure at QW Law School. My question is whether the authors have taken into account the body of American law that has long existed on the question of whether torture produces a true confession. This body of law arose under the Fifth Amendment in the days when it was very common for rubber hoses and other mechanisms of torture to be used to beat confessions out of people. And the Supreme Court and other courts held that, among other reasons for suppressing such confessions from evidence, is that torture was unlikely to bring the truth, and it would be unreliable to use such a confession. Occasionally, there would be a case where the evidence elicited by torture was corroborated by independent evidence. Then the issue was more difficult, and the courts held as a matter of due process. You couldn't get evidence that way. But I would think if you research the Fifth Amendment cases, you might find both precedents on why torture doesn't yield reliable confessions, and possibly you could look into the cases where the confession, the improperly extracted confession, was corroborated by independent evidence, and see if you come up with any indication that would assist you in answering your question as to the unreliability or otherwise of torture to extract confessions.
Yeah, I suppose then the question is, under traditional American jurisprudence, if the findings of the Supreme Court and other courts have been that confessions are A, unreliable, or B, a violation of due process, or C, both, is there a difference between confessions and torture in a police house and torture when you're holding an enemy combatant overseas?
I mean, I don't know. No, but I
Because I do think in some ways that's how they justify a lot of this. We create military commissions, which have not exactly the same sort of rights. We detain people under the status of enemy combatant, and they try to, again, I'm no lawyer or legal scholar either, but I think they've tried to set up a separate category that removes these suspects from the reach, and thus the protections of the American criminal justice system. And the debate has been, to what degree they can do that and to what degree the president can do that on his own. And it seems as if on that latter question, he has lost more than he's gained in that fight.
Yeah, just a comment. I mean, the word torture is very, and it gets bandied about a great deal, and people talk about Guantanamo being a gulag, and I think, to say that Guantanamo is a gulag is an immense disservice to all the millions of people who actually really did die in a gulag. And I think we have to be careful about the way we use the word torture. I think there's no doubt that Abu Omar was tortured. Waterboarding, it seems, is probably torture. Is sleep deprivation torture? I'm not sure. Abuse, coercion, sometimes these words might, I think, people on the liberal side of the aisle may not be serving themselves by constantly referring to anything as sort of a form of torture, when in fact it might actually be coercive, it might be abusive, and it might be useful if we could be more precise about our terminology.
Good point. You had a question?
Hi, Catherine Arrowwood from the Centre for Victims of Torture. I actually wanted to ask you as a terrorism expert if you could talk about how these policies are playing out in the Middle East. Often the argument we hear is that we're creating more terrorists than we're solving, so even if some of these policies did work, they were actually, causing more people sort of into Al-Qaeda and other groups. If you could talk a bit about that aspect of it.
Yeah, well, I mean, the United States is going to be hated by people for one reason or another, and often they will choose from a menu about why they hate the United States, and there will be a sort of cause du jour that may be Abu Ghraib, but 2 years from now maybe something else. We should, for our own reasons, get our own house in order rather than necessarily hope that people will dislike the United States less. The Iraq War clearly is the biggest one. I think far is much more important than the question about how we abuse our prisoners. I must say it's very striking. I've just been in Saudi Arabia and I've just been in the Middle East. One thing, there is so little self-reflection about the countries in the Middle East, about the way they deal with their prisoners. I mean, there's a great deal of song and dance about correctly about Abu Ghraib and what we do, and we should be held to a higher standard, etc. But very little self-reflection in these countries. The same person who decries Abu Ghraib will give their own governments a pass about their treatment of their prisoners. But we should obviously get this right for all sorts of reasons that are beyond simple public relations. And we were attacked. The first Trade Center attack happened in '93, long before Abu Ghraib, long before any of this stuff came out. So there will always be people who, particularly on the Al-Qaeda side, since you ask about it, who will want to attack the United States for one reason or another. It would be good if we kind of reduce the number of reasons that seems like a good idea, but we shouldn't be in the business of just trying to appease people who are going to hate us anyway.
I suppose part of the issue is how easy do you want to make it for the foes of America or the
Yeah.
West? And I think even the President Bush and Donald Rumsfeld and others realized that Abu Ghraib, made it far too easy for the rest of the world to even diminish the whole Iraq War project.
Yeah, and this raises an interesting question about Mr. Rodriguez and getting rid of the CIA interrogation tapes of Abu Zubaydah, which, if I was in his position, I would have done the same thing. He was trying to, leaving aside the legality of all of it, pictures speak 1,000 words. Everything that went on in Abu Ghraib was well known. These, it was the pictures that told the story. And so imagine the pictures of Abu Zubaydah being waterboarded, becoming public. I think there wouldn't be much of a debate about whether or not that was torture.
Any further questions? No? Well, then let me thank Peter and Katherine for enlightening us today and for contributing to Mother Jones. And you can go to the newamerica.net website to find more of their work. And again, you can go to motherjones.com to find the story that Peter wrote for us.
And others in this excellent issue.